A lot of patients want to know why they should consider participating in a pulmonary hypertension study. What's in it for them? I think one benefit is the ability to try new therapies that have not yet been approved but may be beneficial to their disease. And so oftentimes studies have earlier trials that suggest benefit, and so it gives you the opportunity to participate in a trial utilizing one of those medications which you can't get prescribed to you routinely. Another advantage is the increased frequency with which you'll be in contact with your healthcare providers. I think this is beneficial for a couple reasons. One is because you'll be spending more time with your healthcare team, it gives you the opportunity to ask questions about your disease and learn more in an unpressured manner where you can really take a lot of time and ask detailed questions of your healthcare team. Another advantage is the additional monitoring you get during these trials. Most of these trials are going to require blood work, echocardiograms, walk tests, etc., that will give your team information about how your disease is doing. And it's often the cost for all this additional testing is covered by the clinical trial. I think the main reason that patients should participate in pulmonary hypertension, though, is a more societal. By participating in registries and in clinical trials, it really furthers our understanding of the natural history of the disease and how we can best diagnose and treat pulmonary hypertension. Without the participation in clinical trials of previous patients, many of the treatments that we use for pulmonary hypertension today would not have been FDA approved and available to our patients today. And so it's really essential that we continue to perform clinical research so that we know what therapies work, what the best way to diagnose people is, and how this disease is going to behave. It's also hoped that further study will help us understand which treatments work best for which patients so that we can personalize the way that we treat individual patients. So why do researchers need volunteers? Historically, we had pretty limited options for pulmonary hypertension. It's a relatively rare disease. If you want to do a study of, say, systemic hypertension, there's thousands of potential participants, but we have a smaller pool to draw from. And if it weren't for the people that participated in clinical trials earlier on, the multiple agents that we have available for treatment today would not have ever reached a state where they were approved. And so it's only through the efforts of other research volunteers that we have the many treatments that are available today. Who can participate in a clinical trial? It really varies depending on the study that's being done. All these studies have inclusion and exclusion criteria that you'll have to meet. And unfortunately, not everyone who wants to participate in a study can participate. And so the researchers that are running the study will have to review those inclusion and exclusion criteria to make sure you're a candidate for the trial. What's the informed consent process? So once you inquire about a trial and you're interested in a trial, if the researchers will basically review your history, and if you meet the general inclusion and exclusion criteria and elect to move forward with the trial, they'll go through what's called an informed consent. And so what that is, it's an explanation of what the trial involves, what they're going to be asking of you, an explanation of both the benefits and the risks of participation in that clinical trial. This is a good opportunity for you to ask questions of the study so that you have a full understanding of what's involved in the trial. Questions that are worth asking, what's the medication that's being studied and how does it work? Has it been tested before? And in what manner and what type of patients did they test it in? So you may ask, if it's been shown to be effective, was it in pulmonary hypertension patients or was it in patients with a different medical condition? Knowing the side effects of the medication is important. So can you anticipate that there'll be adverse effects? And if so, how serious could those adverse effects be and how commonly do they occur? Other things to ask will be, what exactly does the study entail? You want to know how it's going to impact you from a lifestyle standpoint and how much time it's going to consume. What is the intervention? Is it a medication that you take by mouth? Is it an IV infusion or a subcutaneous injection? Other questions worth asking are, how is the study going to be run and what are the procedures of the study? Not all studies are done in the same manner. Some studies you'll know exactly what medication you're going to receive, and everyone who is in the study gets the experimental medication. Other studies are what we call randomized controlled trials, and so patients are randomly assigned to two groups, and one group will get the experimental medication and the other group will get placebo. And so knowing whether you're definitely going to get the intervention or if there's a chance that you're going to get placebo is an important question to ask. You may also want to know if the same number of patients will be placed in the experimental arm as in the placebo arm, because not all studies enroll in that manner. Some will have a greater number of patients in the experimental arm. It's also worth asking investigators if after a period of time, all patients will be allowed to get the experimental medication. Some studies will do an initial randomized portion of the trial and then roll over to what they call an open label portion, where all patients know that they're getting the experimental medication. And so knowing that you'll be eligible to get the therapy even if you got placebo up front, you'll want to know the risks and benefits in comparison to your current pulmonary hypertension therapy. So are there additional risks of adverse events? Do you have to change or modify your current pulmonary hypertension regimen? Who oversees your medical care during the trial? Is it going to be your primary pulmonary doctor who typically manages your pulmonary hypertension medications, or is it going to be the researcher who's going to take over and be responsible for telling you what medications you should be taking and how to adjust them? And then what tests will be involved. And a lot of studies will require testing along the way, and things like 6-minute walk tests, echocardiograms, and if so, how often are they going to be performed, and will that information be shared with your treatment team? Will blood be drawn? And if so, how often and how much? And when it is drawn and results return, how will that information be used? Will that be shared with your treatment team? You'll also want to know if they're collecting personal information and how it's stored. Now, all studies generally require that this information is de-identified and protected so that your personalized healthcare information will not be shared outside of the researchers. And so they do everything in their power to protect your personalized health identifiers. Now, other things to ask, do you have time to commit to a randomized trial? A lot of these studies require a number of visits, and while that can be beneficial in that you get increased exposure and face time with healthcare providers, it can also be taxing, particularly for patients who still work or have a busy home life. And so knowing how often you have to visit the study site, how far is the study site from your home, how long will you be there when you're getting your treatments or doing study visits, and then will you be reimbursed? Some studies have the ability to reimburse you for travel expenses and for time when you participate. Some studies will even pay for overnight lodging and things like that. And so knowing those things may influence your decision to participate in a clinical trial. What happens if you're injured or hospitalized during the trial? In general, the study will not be liable for any injuries or hospitalizations that result during the trial. If there was a side effect or adverse reaction to the medication, the participating center would provide care for you, but you can't, say, file a malpractice suit because of the informed consent process and the agreement that there is a risk of adverse reactions during the study. And then after the trial ends, you want to know what happens. How long are you required to do follow-up care? So a lot of these studies want to follow you longer term to make sure there's no adverse effects that were unanticipated from the medication, and also to see if there's long-term benefits from the intervention. And so they may require kind of serial follow-up visits. If you benefited from the medication, it's also good to know whether you'll actually continue to have access to it. Some studies are able to offer ongoing access to the study drug, whereas other studies, after the study is over, you'll be taken off the medication and will not be able to go back on it. And so knowing whether that's the case is a good question to ask. A lot of patients want to know if they'll receive the study results when they're available. Generally, the studies will have a period where they close the results and analyze the data from the study. And once that happens, they're allowed to release to patients whether they were randomized into placebo or if they got the experimental medication. Additionally, when the study is concluded and the results were released, they should notify the participants as to the study results and whether there was a positive study that showed clinical benefit or if it was a negative study that did not show benefit. So how do you start? How do you get involved in a clinical trial? A good place to start is with your pulmonary hypertension specialist. They may have ongoing clinical trials at their institution that you may be a candidate for. If there's no trials at their particular institution, they may be able to refer you to other centers that have clinical trials going on that they're aware of. There's also registries. The Pulmonary Hypertension Association has a registry called FAR that a lot of patients elect to participate in. And by following the natural history of the disease, it gives us a lot of information that we find helpful furthering our understanding of this disease. They may ask you for blood, what we call a biobank, so that we can better study the genetics of the disease and look for what we call biomarkers that may be helpful in predicting the clinical course of the disease. Another good place to get information about clinical trials is by talking to other patients with pulmonary hypertension. A good place to meet other patients and network with them is at pulmonary hypertension support groups. These support groups not only provide social support to patients with pulmonary hypertension, but they provide education and resources to patients. They may be able to provide you information about ongoing clinical trials at centers outside of your own. The website clinicaltrials.gov also provides a list of all trials that are currently enrolling in the United States. And so if you search for pulmonary hypertension, you may be able to find clinical trials in your area. And then the Pulmonary Hypertension Association website at phassociation.org has a research link or portion of the website that provides a list of ongoing clinical trials, and that's a great place to look for information on potential clinical trials that you can participate in as well.